Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the TopCyberPro podcast. I'm founder and CEO of TopCyberPro.com, Jim West, and I have today Mr. Mike Holcomb, who's we're going to talk today about OTIT and ICS SCADA. We hear these acronyms a lot, and I think that sometimes we kind of we hear and like, okay, industrial stuff or chemical plants and factories and other these things that like, well, I don't work there, so what does it matter to me? And we sometimes kind of dismiss it because it doesn't immediately impact our world. And but we don't understand how much of an impact it does have on our world. And so Mike's going to help kind of explain things for us and give us a little bit more inside perspective on what these things are and what matters to us. So without further ado, Mr. Holcomb.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I'm glad that you're here. Can you start with first off, what does these acronyms mean? Let's throw out a couple of these acronyms and just so people can, they might have heard about them before, but now that we're starting to get into this topic and kind of sink into the pool of this topic, can you kind of step us through what these acronyms are, what they mean, and more importantly,
Sure.
why does it matter to the average person watching this?
Sure, yeah. It probably makes sense to start with OT, operational technology, which is really an umbrella term that has popped up over the last couple of years, especially that people use to talk about how we have different systems that we use to control things out in the real world. So if you think of a power plant, right? In that power plant that we're using to generate electricity that we use in our daily lives, in every aspect of our daily lives, that we have different types of systems. Like I think you started to mention some of those, like a PLC or a programmable logic controller. That PLC will sit inside of that power plant and it could have a task like monitoring the speed of a turbine, right? Making sure that that turbine is spinning at a certain speed, right? Not too fast, not too slow, right? To be able to that turbine turns a generator, which in turn generates electricity. We also have to make sure that the turbine under certain conditions doesn't overheat, right? Those are different types of these industrial processes that you started to touch on that we use control systems to monitor, right? To make sure everything's performing as it should. And what if, oh, maybe the turbine's not going as fast or as slow as it should, or maybe it's starting to heat up. The control system can take action and readjust the process so it brings everything back ideally into line and where it should be, so that way operations continues and we're in the case of a power plant, we continue to generate electricity uninterrupted. So it's kind of like the idea of OT as a whole, right? These different systems that we use to control physical processes out in the real world. And they're everywhere. A lot of people, I didn't even really think about it, before I started to get into OT cyber back in 2010 when Stuxnet was announced. But the idea was seeing it in farming, right? It's like, how do we collect food? How do we get it even to the store, right? The transportation, it's all OT now these days. Right. Again, we mentioned electricity. What about the clean water that comes out of the tap, or that you're taking a shower or a bath in? Right. Those all come from water treatment facilities. That's all run by OT, or sometimes you'll hear like ICS, industrial control systems, or just control systems, which is just a subset of OT. And then sometimes we used to hear a lot. People used to use SCADA as just a general encompassing term. So I used to have SCADA and ICS. Really, what it means is ICS is LAN. So if all of your systems and the processes, like if all your systems and the things you're controlling are at one location, like at that one power plant, that's that's ICS, right? So it's just local. If you're going over a WAN link, so if I'm generating electricity and I'm transmitting that power over long distances, it's going to go over lines through substations. We have to be able to monitor and control the activity at those substations to make sure we have clean power going out to the public. So you're going to be monitoring that connection over some type of wide area link. So that's where you have SCADA come in. But the idea is that OT is the umbrella term. We have ICS if it's localized. It's SCADA if it's going over the wire over some type of WAN link. And then it really going back kind of full circle with the term SCADA, which stands for supervisory control and data acquisition, which is really what we're trying to accomplish with just OT as a whole, anyways, is monitor how something is performing, right? If there's an issue that we need to adjust for, take action, right? Hopefully automate that action. And that if we're not able to automate that action, or if that automated action failed to resolve the issue, then we set up a bunch of alerts so we can bring in a human operator to take action before things go bad.
And so, if you're still with us, you as the viewer are still with us here at this point. Mike has given a really good, walkthrough and kind of sinking into the pool of the knowledge of this domain. There might be some people still going, well, I get water, electricity, but, I pay for these things. I trust that these businesses and companies and everybody's making sure everything's secure and safe. Well, here's the thing, back several decades ago, everybody's familiar with engineering, right? Engineers, right? People go to universities, do 4 to 10 years and studying a discipline or a subsection of engineering, whereas electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, like all of these different categories of engineers, right? And so to do these processes where it's a chemical facility, a water plant, electrical plant, all of these major systems that make our lives easier, we used to be, we'd just go, find a certain spot in the ground, dig, and then have a well, and then we'd have our water. Then would eventually, as technology improved, instead of having to send, our junk and excrement out of or put it in a pit or hole somewhere, we ended up developing septic systems, and then we started building cities and neighborhoods, and as things grew and the technology enabled us to do easier and better things to make our lives better and better, it eventually became these huge plants, these huge facilities, huge filtration systems, the water filtration, everything. Mentioned water, power. There's other things that are impacted. Chemicals. When we think of petrochemical industry, or we think of just a pure chemical industry with compounds, elastomers, and all of these things that have to run through several multiple processes. You have to do certain conditions. You got to heat up the chemical, chill down the chemical, mix the
Right.
chemical, keep it away from oxygen, oxidizers. There's all these processes, and all of these things require knowing exactly down to maybe even 20 places behind the decimal of pressures and just flow rates, and all of this is information that has to be tracked. So way back when these engineers were coming up and making these systems and making our lives easier, things got more and more complex and more complicated. So eventually, instead of having human beings look at the little pressure gauges and nozzles, they got to a point where they said, "Wait, we could develop this little chip now that we have these computers and these embedded these ICs, integrated circuits. We can now program logic, so it does a PLC, to do a simple function instead of a guy going over there with his little clipboard and looking at it and doing this times 1,000 people across the factory. They're like, oh, we could just put these little boards in place that could replace a person. Remember the robotics industry? Everybody thought these robots in the car industry was going to replace all the jobs. Well, it didn't replace jobs, but it created new ones. Well, now you have these PLCs. These people have to go out, and so you might have reduced the amount of people doing the monitoring and taking out the data on the clipboard, bringing it back to, calling it back into a headquarters. Now we had these things instantly reporting 24/7 their statuses for whatever the operation that PLC was doing. You do this times hundreds of thousands of times. That's a lot of data, right? And now with that, the capability expands for instead of having a team of, let's say, 100 engineers, you can now maybe run with 10. And so, in business, as you can collapse and you could do more with less, obviously technology is going to be embraced. And so when they built those technologies, because unlike OT, unlike IT is about what we immediately have to interact with, right? And so we need more megabytes and gigabytes on our phone. We need more resolution on the picture. We want more and more and more. So as IT exploded in its capability, OT kind of really, once it got established, kind of stayed the same, and no one really expected to have a lot of speed, a lot of anything, because it just needed to turn to do the function and do it over and over times millions, hundreds of millions to billions of times, do that thing. And again, this technology that was created, it kind of fulfilled what it needed to do. But at the same time, as we exploded with the emerging technology over here, this largely stayed the same. And that's a good and a bad thing, because as it stayed the same, we kind of got very complacent into that. Oh, it's always going to work. No big deal. But then what happened? The internet, right? The internet made everything, networking got super advanced to the point to where we're like, oh, so instead of having just 100 guys on staff, we can maybe even crunch it down to five, because all we need, instead of having, at each plant, X number of engineers, we can now have just in a region with several plants having a smaller group. But we need to get that data to those guys, because again, have the human resources meeting your technical resources, it started to collapse. And then they're like, oh, well, we'll just connect these plants to the internet, and we'll all have them sending this information up to one server and cover a big region. It sounded great on paper, but what they forgot was, while IT had made all these advancements, but also a lot of risk came with it, these old OT systems and networks had stayed the same for decades. And now what they didn't know, you don't know what you don't know, was that there were all these vulnerabilities, all these ways that once you interconnected that OT and that IT network, oh boy. So, Mike, you did also mention, so there's one little word that he kind of threw in there. And if you haven't heard of Stuxnet, I implore all of you to just do a simple Google search. I'm going to put the Wired magazine article about the Stuxnet attack, because I think that's one of the most riveting articles written about it. But Mike, can you maybe step us through, the impact that once we interconnected the OT and the IT world, what some of the dangers it brought, that again, maybe early on we weren't aware, but we're trying to get more aware today.
Sure. Yeah, you think if you had a manufacturing plant 30 years ago, it created a product. So I always like to use, the day job we do a lot in life sciences. We built the world's largest insulin plant, which I think is an amazing thing. And so as you're manufacturing insulin, back in the old days, right, you would have somebody literally you tracking, right, how many insulin injections did you make, right? And then they take that information to the back office so they can do things like coordinate shipping and logistics. Whereas today, right, if you connect OT and IT together, if you connect your manufacturing plant and your back office together with a network connection, then you can just take the information from OT and give it to IT to tell them, hey, we manufactured 1,000 injections today. And they automatically have that information in the systems, and it can automatically go ahead and schedule shipping and logistics. And that's just one example of why we want to connect OT and IT. Of course, the danger of anything when there's a network connection, especially if the internet's involved, if it's not controlled appropriately, right? If it's not secured, then what you see, like where we had the Colonial Pipeline incident back in May of 2021, and that was really the big watershed moment for really the entire industry from an OT cybersecurity perspective. But in that case, you had an employee in the back office clicking on a link or opening up an attachment that they weren't supposed to, right? They infected their system and all of the IT systems with ransomware. And that infection started to move into the OT network, which had to be shut down. So that way it didn't impact safety or future availability of the largest pipeline in the United States. And
Yeah,
so
that was scary.
that's, yeah, and that's where we see ever since then ransomware operators, hacktivists, all of these other different types of attackers have really come out of the woodwork to focus on OT, right? They understand now, hey, I can make money targeting OT environments, not just IT. And it's kind of that idea, well, oh, if I'm going to take hostage a manufacturing plant, right, and they are going to lose millions of dollars an hour for being down, they're going to pay me to get back up online. And so that's where we've seen this explosion in attacks since Colonial Pipeline a few years ago. And so it kind of comes full circle, but I think it helps kind of highlight, yes, there's in most OT environments, like that manufacturing facility or a power plant, we have connections between OT and IT to exchange data at a minimum. Of course, IT can still be very vulnerable. And we have employees clicking on links and opening up attachments and
Yeah.
bringing in infected, USB drives and connecting them to their workstations. And that once an attacker is into the IT environment, it doesn't take much to move into the OT network. And what I think a lot of people don't realize, I know it was really surprising to me when I first started getting into OT that you can go now into a fairly modern environment that was built within the last 10, 15, even 20 years. And you know what? There's a bunch of Windows systems in there. It's
Hmm.
like, wow, I thought, right, it was going to be all, these special types of machines, and we talk about right, PLCs and RTUs and DCS, but you know, when I went to my first power plant like 12 years ago, right, and I remember the plant manager was giving me the tour. And he's like, "Oh, we're going to take you in the data center," and it's like, "Oh, this nice pristine data center," and it was like, "Oh, and here's our Active Directory domain controllers, and here's our file servers, right? Here's the firewalls, right?" And just going through, I was like, "Wow, this." From that perspective, it's very much an IT environment. So when you think of an attacker, they're targeting IT, right? They have the especially Windows-based attack skills. And so it doesn't take them much to be able to at least move into OT and take over all the Windows systems in OT. Now, just because you have access to the Windows systems in OT doesn't mean you can blow up a power plant or take the manufacturing facility down or offline. But it does give you a connection and it does give you the ability to find out information about how that environment is engineered and how it's controlled to where you could potentially have that type of impact. But it does take time, and that's why we don't have as many of these what we call high impact events where there is some type of an explosion, right? That would take a plant down um, permanently, right?
Yes.
Because of that level of difficulty. It's easy to get into IT, right? It's easy to get into typically into those Windows machines in the OT network, but making that transition from those Windows systems to the true control systems like the PLCs, the DCS, right? How do I impact the actual process and the environment to do something bad? That's where the attackers have to understand and think like an engineer and reverse engineer the process. Again, that takes time. And if we're doing our job right as defenders, right, we should be monitoring the network.
Hmm.
And so we should be finding the attackers in the environment and kicking them out. The only problem is it's less than 5% of environments globally that actually are doing network security monitoring in OT environments
In
today.
that side. Yeah. One of the things about hackers and attackers and APTs, advanced persistent threat groups, it's that in business, everything has to be confidential, proprietary, sensitive information to that business. And so sometimes when there's an attack, a breach, or even attempts, a lot of businesses didn't want that information getting out there because anytime anyone hears anything about hackers, attackers, or anything, they don't want investor and stakeholder confidence to plummet. They want to keep their investors, happy and operations going. They don't want the bad news to ever get out. Everybody wants to just kind of contain the bad news. But it's the
Right.
opposite in the hacker world. If an attack group or attacker figures out a way to defeat like a Simmons PLC or any other like a Snyder PLC, for example, there's a lot of those two are probably the top two PLCs across industry. But once they figure out a way to kind of bypass some certain minimal security standards or controls, or even start attacking certain businesses and sectors, they like to announce it. They like to put all of their information out. They share the tactics and tools and techniques that they use to hack into different things. And it doesn't take much for someone to go, oh, let me take that information. Oh, I can just reapply this, make some adjustments, and now I go off attacking another sector or another industry. So in the hacking community, there's a lot more information sharing amongst them, honor among thieves, I guess. Whereas businesses, for the longest time just didn't want to talk to each other because one, it would be seen as weakness. Oh, well, I'm putting all this money into me just trying to keep myself secure. Why would I try to benefit my competitors? And it was
Mhm.
viewed as differently than that. We're beginning to see, like the, threat intelligence feeds. We're seeing threat intelligence where groups are coming together to share their use cases and the issues that they're experiencing, hoping that they can collectively work through these problems together. And you have things like the CTID from MITRE, the Centers for Threat Informed Defense, and other groups where these panels or groups of different companies in different industries are starting to collaborate a little bit more because to have a chance against the whole world of attackers. And if they're communicating and collaborating, then these businesses also need to do that. So we've been seeing that happen, but not yet at the scale that we really need it to be because we still have that old mindset of, well, I'm not going to share all my vulnerabilities or weaknesses or my issues with other companies. And I think we have to get beyond that, even with competitors, because, just because you have two companies, that could be two competitors, there's always opportunity to be stronger together. And I think that that's something that a lot of stakeholders and executives, directors working in these businesses that have a lot large OT networks need to consider is joining these boards and just at least if you're just a fly on the wall and just ingesting the information about your competitors, partners, and other people in your industry sector, that's better than doing nothing, better than keeping the blinders on. Um, Mike, I do know you have a couple ebooks and publications around this. Could you talk about those?
Yeah, those were created really just to help people get into OT cybersecurity. I know when I started back in 2010, it was very difficult. It was very frustrating, right? There weren't books to go buy, there weren't classes to go take. I was trying to talk with the few contacts I had. I'm from San Diego, so I would talk with San Diego Gas and Electric friends and folks at the water district, but nobody wanted to have the conversation, and it really came down to nobody was doing cybersecurity for OT back then, and they didn't know what I was talking about. It took me a while to catch on, but it was just very frustrating. And it can still, even today, be very, very frustrating for folks to get started, whether you're coming from an IT background like myself, or you're coming from an OT background, like if you're an engineer or a PLC technician, or you do operations and maintenance in a facility. So there's two versions. One is for, yeah, if you're coming from IT, especially IT cybersecurity, here's the 10 things that you need to do to kind of follow this path to really get started in OT cyber. And then the other version helps, and the folks from the OT side, the engineers and other automation folks, to really do the same thing. And most of the steps at the end, the last 8 steps are the same for everybody, but
Okay.
how you get started is very different because someone in engineering, they probably don't understand the basic mechanics of things like networking, believe it or not. I used to think, well, engineers know everything, right? It's like, but they don't, right? So they don't typically understand the basics of networking, right? So that would be one thing that where they need to start, right? And how they get the basic cybersecurity information and knowledge, like Security Plus, right? Is a great place to start to learn that knowledge. Whereas if you're coming like myself from an IT background, oh, okay, I know the networking, I know the cybersecurity stuff, but like we were talking in the very beginning, I don't know what OT is, or ICS, or DCS, or RTU, right? So it's understanding not only what these things are, but really understanding the engineering mindset, right? You have to start to learn to think like an engineer to really understand these environments. Probably at Dragos talks about OT as being IT plus physics, right? And you have to understand the physics of the environment and how does this power plant generate this electricity, right? And that power plant could be completely different than a power plant you literally have 2 miles down the
Yeah.
road. And so it's why I've always, especially these days, really just love being an OT because I'm learning something new, if not multiple things every day, because I'm learning all, the engineering aspect, not the cyber. Yeah, I've been doing that for quite a while, but learning from the engineering perspective is pretty amazing. Always something new. And I just happen to work at one of the largest engineering companies in the world, so I get to work with some of the best engineering minds that are out there. So I'm very fortunate and kind of like to put that into those books to share with folks and help some folks out there not be frustrated.
Where can people find what websites or places that can they find these two ebooks?
So you go to MikeHolcomb.com. It's HOLCOMB.com. There should be links there. They'll take it. It's just on my GitHub. So
Yes.
the GitHub is utilsec, UTILSEC for folks. It's also the handle for my YouTube channel. And that's where I have the 25, it's like 27-hour course that actually also covers how
Nice.
to get started in OT ICS
Mike, if you give me
cybersecurity.
all the links to all of those resources, I'll put them in the description below. And you
For
watching,
sure.
don't worry about having to rewind and say, what did Mike say again? It's
Take
okay.
notes.
Don't worry about the Google search because we have the links right down here in the description of this video below. So you don't have to do nothing but click and you're already there. So thank you for sharing those resources with us, Mike. I like to, that we could talk forever, obviously, about the different aspects and things like defensive depth strategies. There's so much more that this goes to. So folks, this is just the surface level kind of stuff that me and Mike have been talking about. And if your interest is already peaked, I highly recommend you check out like his YouTube channel, read his two ebooks. We're going to have the links in the description below so that you can get more information and then more empowered is the way I would look at it. Because the more information knowledge you have about this and technology, the better you can one understand it. Because understanding is crucial to everything because it gives you the rest of the context of the why. And then when you start bridging, if you're coming from cyber IT and you have all this knowledge, you're like, oh, now I understand this thing better. Now I could take this knowledge I have and experience and see how it fits. How do these pieces fit? And then if you're the person that you're a non-IT cyber person, hey, you'll be able to, learn it from inside out, right? Learn it from what these things are and how they work and how they operate. And then you can adding the IT cyber knowledge is easy. Just like if you're cyber IT, adding the OT knowledge, it's not rocket science, folks. If you could read and comprehend, and you could just take some courses like what Mike has on his site that we have in the description below, it doesn't take long. I think you mentioned 20 something hours of a course.
Yeah, it gives you the basic fundamentals, and I think helps people understand kind of what you're along the lines you're mentioning, that there's a lot of similarities between IT and OT. A lot of OT people will say no, like no, actually they're more in common than not when we're looking at it from a cyber perspective.
Mhm.
But there are certain areas like vulnerability management in OT, which is very different than how it's done in IT. So you need to be aware of when they're different, right? And definitely what those differences are, because you don't want to be like myself running into a power plant, 14 years ago saying, "Oh yeah, just patch all these systems and reboot them." And it's like,
Oh no,
well, no,
sometimes
that
they don't come
would
back.
right, yeah, it's going to take the plant down, or
Yeah.
in some environments, right, you literally could kill somebody, right? That's not the approach. So you need to understand, yeah, where they're different and and how to address those differences. But the OT environment does need more people, especially those with a cybersecurity background, to help the engineers also, learn about cybersecurity. And really, it takes us coming together to be able to secure these different types of environments, especially in critical infrastructure we rely on every day of our lives.
Yes. So, Mike, I know we've had a good, solid technical discussion there, but I do want to ask, questions I ask all my guests. So, if you would just be patient with me. One of the first questions, my most favorite question I like to ask all my guests, because we all started from level one, right? Just like a video game, and you select your character, who you are, your personality, and how you dress and
Sure.
everything, and then you decide this is the pathway. I want to be an apprentice in this, or I want to start learning this, and I go to level two, three. And of course, now you're what I use a RuneScape analogy where you're level 99, you've hit the maximum level in your respective field here. And so as a level
Yeah.
99, there was a day where you started off at level one. You said, okay, I'm going to go in this pathway for my main character in my
Right.
own video game of my life. So could you
Yeah.
maybe share us if there's a story behind what your day one, the first day you made the decision, hey, this is interesting. I want to go ahead and start working through the levels of this in OT and ICS, etc. Could you share with us your day one story?
Yeah, it's kind of like day one, or maybe more like the old Batman year one, where I was in junior high, and I guess my best friend Chris, he was actually one of the more tried and true hacker type kiddies. So he was the one cracking games, right? So you could copy them illegally. He would write cheat
Yeah.
codes for unlimited lives, unlimited gold. He actually, this is of course where you had to use the old phone lines to dial into bulletin boards before we had the internet. And so he rewired the phone box on the street so he could use somebody else's phone lines essentially to
Yeah,
get
free game.
free long distance. Yeah, and it just always stuck with me. Now I was the good kid, right? I would never do any of these things, but I would watch. And I always thought Chris was the nicest guy in the world. So it's like if he would do these things, like what would happen if like someone was like really, bad or really evil? Like what could they do? And you got a kind of glimmer of that in some of the bulletin board stuff back in the day, and that just always stuck with me. And then fast forward to like my first like real IT and those networking jobs when the internet was just first coming to businesses. And I remember my boss was standing behind me as I was hooking up the first internet router for this company. And I started to go in and assign it a password. And he was like, "Why are you assigning it a password?" He was offended. It's like nobody's going to find the router on the internet, right? Nobody's going to. And it's like, well, no, they will. And that was kind of, that really cemented it for me because it was obvious like a lot of people just lack of awareness
Yes.
and just not knowing. And so that's probably why I've always gravitated, I think, in some degree to helping awareness and education. Um, and and so yeah, it's just and it kind of grew from there. And
Awesome.
I've been doing really cybersecurity since day one. So yeah, I
Wow.
took a detour through a movie theater in high school and a bowling alley for I think 2 years, and but everything else has been IT and cybersecurity jobs.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing your day one story with us. Across a long, career where you have, a few decades behind you, and you still have several more decades ahead of you. And we're so fortunate to have you working within the cybersecurity field. This had to been along your journey so far. There've been like managers, colleagues, maybe leaders in the industry that you admired, looked up to, kind of at one point in your career, say, you know what, I want to be like them along your journey. So the purpose of this question is really to kind of, whether these folks are with us or no longer with us anymore, is to kind of shine a light on those people that helped you along your career. And again, it could be colleagues, managers that was real, influential upon you as went through, like I said, the levels of a career advancing yourself. So is there any names you'd like to
Sure.
shine a light on, pay homage to?
Yeah, there's a few. I've been thinking about these guys lately too. I need to reach out. Yeah, there was a gentleman named Lindbug that he was the gentleman. He got me actually started into teaching. So that company where I was setting up the router, it was actually a technical training company, and they taught like Windows MCSE courses, and this is in the NT 4.0 days.
Yeah.
And when I got hired, I was like the book guy. I hired the books for the classes. I set up all the machines. So I was doing all the Windows installs. I was a little grunt, and he
He
was
was
like,
he was doing
like,
he's grinding through the levels, where you do the
right,
repetitive work, you doing the grind through the levels.
right.
I get it.
It's exactly what it was. And he said, "You know what? You know this stuff. You would I think you'd be great at this." And he really championed that. and that just changed, I mean, my life in so many ways. Not I mean, it doubled and tripled my salary within, I think, 6 months, which
Wow.
is life changing, right, for a
Yes.
lot of people. But also, I think of, yeah, I mean, I put a YouTube course out on, for everybody, it's to watch. It's, that is rooted, in that time, for sure,
Wonderful.
for
Well, thank
sure.
you for
Yeah. So
sharing that with us. This is a moment of the podcast where I like to take a moment of levity because we've been talking acronyms, jargon, tech, OTIT, and at this point, usually people are like, okay, how much deeper are they going to go? And so I assure you, folks, we're not going too much deeper because again, that would be a whole other hour plus of discussion. But this moment of levity, I like to kind of ask some rapid fire questions. There's no right or wrong answer, and so if you wouldn't mind humoring me, I'm gonna hit you with some questions, and whatever the first answer you think of, just let it go. You ready?
we can do that.
Okay, we're gonna go. We're real strong right out the gate. Is a hot dog a sandwich?
That's a good question. I go with the technical definition and say yes.
Oh, so hot dog's a sandwich. Okay, let's go with cake or pie.
I'm a pie guy. Having your birthday on Thanksgiving every couple of years, yeah,
Okay. Oh, okay. What kind of pie?
apple pie,
Hot or cold? Apple
hot
pie.
definitely, but with cold ice cream on top.
Ice cream on top. I love it. This was going to split the room, but in technology and cyber, we're usually more one or the other. So here it goes: Star Wars or Star Trek?
I used to be hardcore Star Wars and very against Star Trek, and now I've kind of swung the other direction.
Another direction. It's
So
interesting
yeah,
when you talk to like engineers, wholeheartedly, most of them are majority, usually 8 out of 10 are all Star Trek, engineering,
for
Scotty,
sure,
all the
for
science
sure.
and the pseudoscience that was in that series and in the films and
Yeah,
etc. And then over in Star Wars is usually your admins, your like your Windows folks, your systems folks, because
yeah.
again, it takes a lot of belief in the Force. A hammer and a Wookiee can make that Millennium Falcon go to warp, right? Whereas in
All
Star
right,
Trek, you need a crew of 50 and a nuclear core to go into war. So,
right. Yeah.
yeah. What has been your most favorite book of all time that you've read, and what is the last book you've read?
Probably stereotypical, but I've probably read Dune probably a dozen times. So I don't know, I always just go back. It's something, yeah, I probably read the first time when I was 11 or 12, and it's just really always stuck with me. And
Okay.
huge
Well,
fan of the original film.
the original film. So
Yeah.
I'm also a huge fan of the original film. We had like Patrick Stewart. We had a very
Yep.
young. I'm trying to remember. Paul Atreides was played by. Oh, I see.
Kyle, yeah, what's his face?
Oh goodness, I hate when my brain does that. Like I see his face and all of a sudden the name just dropped out of memory.
Kyle
But
MacLachlan. Yeah.
but
Kyle MacLachlan.
yes, yes, Cal McLaughlin. So what I liked about it, now don't get me wrong, the cinematography of the new Doom films is astounding. It's a beautiful, beautiful film, and there's some
Gorgeous.
pretty big name actors that do decent, very good, solid performances. I have no issue with the
For sure.
performances, the actors, but what I do have the deviation that I felt that we needed was in the original with Kyle. He did all the voiceover stuff of his thoughts in his head as
Hmm.
what you were seeing. And to me, that inner monologue being shared with us, the audience, was our connection to him as a character, being in his head.
Yeah.
We kind of lose that with the new versions because they kind
Yeah.
of didn't do that. They want you to kind of
Right.
make the connection yourself, if you will, right? Or listen to what he's saying outside of himself. But to me, I think we missed a lot with not being in his head like the original. So,
Yeah.
but okay, so Dune, all right, I like that. Um, with our day jobs, we do a lot of work that we do in job number one, but a lot of professionals I find makes the time in their nights, weekends, holidays to give back. And whether they're giving back through volunteer work, charities, nonprofits, this is the purpose of this question is kind of give you an opportunity to shine a light on these organizations and things that whether it's something you've created or something you actively participate in, or just something that's near and dear to your heart that you want to shine. I like to use the term shine a light on the good work that these organizations, charities, etc., that are doing in the world. Apologies for that.
Sure.
So is there anything that you're involved with, whether with your time, energy, or money, or just you want to shine a light on the great work that nonprofit, charity, or volunteer work?
Yeah, I mean, I already mentioned the books and the YouTube channel where try to get as much free information out there about OT cybersecurity, so somebody doesn't have to go spend $10,000 on a class,
Hmm.
and you don't have to be frustrated. I think that's probably the biggest to me. I also run the local ISSA chapter here in Greenville, South Carolina. So for our IT cybersecurity folks, we also started the B-Sides Greenville conference
Oh,
here as well
nice.
8 years ago. So yeah, I think we had a really great turnout for Greenville, South Carolina. I think we
Mhm.
came out about 400, and we're gonna shoot for 500 this year. So if anybody's in the area on September 27th, we'd love to have you.
Okay.
And then that kind of rolled up into this year. I founded B-Sides ICS. So I got permission from the B-Sides powers that be, pretty much just Jack Daniels, to run an ICS OT specific version of B-Sides. And we had that in Tampa this year, right before the S4 conference. The S4 conference, for folks that don't know, it's the largest ICS OT cybersecurity conference. So it's like the RSA of the OT world. So
Nice.
we did it the day before, and it was really, yeah, it was awesome, and had we had, yeah, sure, some of like the greatest minds in the field, but we also had probably about 30% of the 200 folks were there. We sold out. Um, we're brand new to OT, and so you have like the world leaders in OT cybersecurity, and people that they're just learning to spell OT really in a lot of respects. And, we bring them all together and just mix them up.
It's good.
It was awesome.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
So
Love it.
I'm really excited. And we have folks already talking about spinning them up in like Mexico City and Singapore and India. And yeah,
Wow.
I can't
I
be
love that
happier.
it's just growing and getting people together, right? That's really about it. Sharing, as I said
Right.
earlier in the podcast, having these people representing and working for all these big organizations to get together, share information, and kind of build that kind of collaboration and knowledge sharing that the hackers are doing every day. And I love to hear about these events growing. So if you would provide me all the links to the events in Florida, your
For
event
sure.
in South Carolina, all the links you provide me again, folks, the social medias and the websites for all these pages, plus his YouTube channel and the courses and everything is going to be in the description below. So please take a few minutes, pause this video, click the description, click through some of these links, check out some of the training and information that Mike here has provided for free. I mean, he could easily charge for this, put a paywall up, but he said no, I want to make this for free, and that's just a testament to the level 99 professional we have here today on the podcast. I want to be respectful of your time, Mike, and I want to just kind of just ask a few more questions because folks truly, truly need to understand that this is a big deal. And I want to refer to about a decade ago, there was an audit done across a bunch of a chain of hospitals that are owned by this one corporation in the West Coast. And this audit uncovered a lot of vulnerabilities and findings. They found that the robotic machines that do surgeries were running on like Windows 95B systems. You mentioned that the OT networks were having a lot of Windows systems in them. There's certain hospitals that would deliver like your medicines and the other things that are, if you're in intensive care in a hospital bed, you don't have always someone always giving you a shot. Sometimes you're hooked up to the machine and there's systems that are delivering everything because they can do it just as good as a person. And, we adopted the technologies to make things easier because, as if nurses didn't have enough to do already to kind of alleviate certain, routine functions, right? But then these systems were being controlled and set on either servers or workstations in the worst case scenarios that were on like Windows 95, Windows 95 A, B, and been forgotten about because the purpose was fulfilled. It's like, oh, the thing works, it's online, it's doing the thing it needs to do. But then as time progressed, no one thought about, oh, these systems need to be patched to maintain. So when this audit happened, it found all these tremendous amounts of vulnerability, all these robotic surgery systems, medicine delivery systems, even the systems that are holding patient records and information were left unencrypted, just and anyone just could get in with regular user access in a lot of cases and start manipulating the data. And again, to kind of tell you why is this dangerous is imagine you're being operated by a surgeon that's on the other side of the world, but using these robots, and all of a sudden the system gets compromised and goes offline in the middle of your surgery. That can kill a person, right? You could be laying in a bed in a hospital ward having your medicines delivered immediately, and someone goes in and manipulates that record, turns another medicine on, turns your off, or increases the dosage, even by the most minuscule amount, can cause drastic situations. And that right there is a real world example of how these systems are built. Just like what Mr. Holcomb was telling us earlier, there are Windows systems now integrated into these OT type of environments and systems that it's a danger. And the worst thing
For
was
sure.
when they put an estimated cost just for this one corporation that had, like, I forget how many hospitals under its corporate umbrella. It would have cost, I
Mhm.
think they estimated between 2.5 and $3 trillion to upgrade everything and all those systems, environments, and technology up to a secure state, which was like the
Yeah.
minimum level of security state, 2.5 to 3 trillion just for that one corporation. And as we all
Yeah.
know, that's not all the hospitals in the US. There's so many hospital chains and
Right.
corporations and entities that operate that if this one on the West Coast was looking this bad, you can only imagine it's the same across the board. And that's what was 10 plus years
A lot
ago
of
when that
times.
audit came out. And when they put out those numbers, we already knew reading the article, those of us in cyber and IT, is like, they're not going to spend that kind of money because that kills their profit margin. And therefore, there'd be almost no reason to even have the business. And that's the
Right.
scary reality we face is that what did they choose to upgrade? What did they leave, to hopefully one day get caught up with another version update? We don't know, and we will never know fully, but that's a great example of why it matters to you. Is again, when we think of our healthcare services, they're also using IT and OT systems as well. Because we a lot of times hear about the water, the electricity, we hear about the big ones, but then we don't think about it when we are in our greatest vulnerability as an individual is when we have to go to the hospital, whether for ourselves, a loved one, a family member. When we're in that hospital, we don't think about how these systems still impact our lives. So with that being said, Bill, what do you see from your perspective? Because we talked about a lot of the industrial industries, but what about the medical
Mhm.
industry? Do you have some insights and perspective on, you know, what they're trying to do to address this? Because again, I know even though that was 10 plus years ago, I know
Yep.
that they did not spend $3 trillion to get secure. And even though,
No,
and again,
no.
I'll add one more thing. Even though if you did spend a bunch of money, there's still spending and things you have to continuously monitor it because things change in our environment all
Sure.
the time. So, Mike, what are your perspectives on that for the healthcare industry?
Yeah, healthcare is, they've come a long way, in the last, 5 years or so, but they still have a long way to go, unfortunately. I think it's one of those where they typically will have to learn the hard way through a ransomware attack that takes down the hospital system, usually, on average, probably 10 days, right? They have to stop all unnecessary surgeries and the interruptions, right? They're taking notes on pen and paper, and so are they delivering, top tier medical service to their patients? No, no, of course not. Have people died because of ransomware infections, or I always go back to the NotPetya attack, which took down, um, you know, hospitals around the world, especially in the UK. Or they
Yes.
were telling, ambulances, don't come here. We can't treat your the patient you have in the back of the ambulance. Just keep going to the next hospital 10 minutes down the road, right? Not ideal.
Mm.
So they've come a long way. They were starting from nothing.
Yes.
So you see a combination of, air gaps, right? So if we have, because you can still have that MRI machine running Windows XP, and it is a multi-million dollar um, updates to because you're not replacing just the operating system, you're replacing the entire MRI machine the way these things are built. And
Yes.
so, yeah, your only option really is to unplug that from the network. And then once you have, your scan data, you can, sneaker net it onto another network to have that data available for the doctors to review. So that, that's one option. Others, look at different compensating controls. And it's the same thing in a power plant or a manufacturing facility. Like I said, they're not going to go through and spend all of the money just to refurbish systems, which they probably wouldn't be able to anyways. And so they have to look at compensating controls. So just like in IT, right, is okay, I have an environment, how can I make it as secure as possible? And I always assume that the attacker is going to get in,
Yeah.
right? One way or the other. It's just a matter of time. So if we go after that principle, it's like, how am I going to make the environment so that we slow down the attacker long enough that if we're doing our job and we're monitoring for that activity, we can catch them in the act quickly and get them off the network as quickly as possible before they do any damage, or at least limit the damage. Right? And that,
Wonderful.
so it really comes down to compensating controls, like, and maybe it's not an air gap, but network segmentation, right? Keep everything segmented as much as possible, right? We're ACLing it, everything off. It's sure it's a step towards the zero trust philosophy,
Mhm.
but it's definitely, that's one thing that's going to slow them down. I'm a big proponent of vulnerability management, right? Continuous vulnerability management. Right? Be looking for those vulnerabilities that present true risk that attackers could use to move through the environment. Right? And that's, I also always preach that people need to learn how to attack systems, because that's the only way you'll really understand how attackers do what they do, how they get into the systems, right? How they move. And if you don't understand that, how can you really defend those environments? You
Yes.
you can't. You can try, but you're not going to be as effective as somebody that has that penetration testing or that attack or that red team knowledge and experience. So, a couple things to throw out there, right? But let's slow down the attackers, learn to think like attackers. We have to be able to identify the attack traffic and get attackers off the network as quickly as possible, because they will get on the network,
Yeah.
right?
It's
It's
gonna
just a
happen.
matter of time. Exactly.
Well, Mike, one of the concepts I want to add to all that, and then thank you for all that perspective and insight. We had I guess it's not a theory anymore. It's this concept of baking security in from the ground level, right? When you talk about projects or talk about building any system of any kind, it's like, hey, make
Sure.
sure your cyber and your IT guys are there to help, review things and bake it in. Because if you try to add security after the fact, either it's going to be super, super expensive, i.e., like that
Right.
hospital situation I gave to kind of retrofit and to bring it up to date, or you're going to have major impacts that hit you because you never considered that being attacked, ransomware, locked out, denial of service, or whatever that disrupts the operation of that system. Now all of a sudden you're paying a
Yeah.
price later. So you got to kind of got that what I
Mhm.
call the risk collateral that builds up through the years and not considering it early on. So when people are doing software code development with DevSecOps these days and other platforms,
Mhm.
baking security in is so crucial because think about it. ICS SCADA, this is one of the ultimate lessons learned where they weren't thinking of that. It wasn't that they weren't aware or just said, oh, forget that and accepted the risk. No one ever accepted the risk. They just said at the time they did the best they could with the technology as it was at that point, and they didn't really think
Right.
so, or they didn't envision a future where there'd be hackers, attacker groups, nation state attackers. They didn't couldn't have fathomed back then. It's kind of like we talked about Star Trek. Imagine, the things that were showing in the early, the original shows and stuff, and we wouldn't have had them. I mean, back then, who would ever thought we would have had a little box of all the information on the world in the palm of our hand? You
Right.
know, uh, but again, times change, technology changes, and oftentimes when we don't consider it in the beginning, now we got to go back and do the best we can. And so, doing things like what Mike mentioned with air gap and network segmentation, all these things are powerful. But again, if you are developing something new, start with baking security in from day one. Have your cyber guy at the table as you're doing the planning and the design and architecture and so forth. Mike, thank you so much for giving of your time. And what I like for all my guests to do is have the final word. So whether you want to talk about IT, ICS, etc., or just offer any advice, guidance, but this is you have the final word.
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks again for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. Again, really, it's just for folks that are be interested in learning a little bit more about OT or control system cybersecurity. Definitely, check out the links, and there's plenty of information. And I always encourage people to learn at least a little, right? Just to have an awareness of what's out there, because OT is everywhere in the
Yes.
world around you. And there's a lot of changes, and there's a lot of threats that are continually growing in that space, and we are going to be more and more impacted as time goes on. So we do need more defenders. But even if people just look at it, just get a basic understanding, and maybe they realize, right, maybe it's not for me, it's not what I want to do full time. That's great too. Right. So you can go and focus on wherever your passion is, right? Or wherever you can help out the most. But I think definitely it definitely helps, especially for folks in IT. folks that are in IT cybersecurity, definitely take an hour or two even just to kind of take a peek, just to see if it's again something that interests you. And if it is, great, we'd love to have you in the community. And if not, more power to you, and good luck in whatever role you're fulfilling out there. It's all about fighting the good fight at the end of the day, and it takes people in IT and people in OT really coming together as a community to be able to protect these environments that we rely on in our daily lives. So, but I do appreciate the time and the opportunity to come share it with everybody.
Well,
So
thank you so much,
thank you.
Mike. And again, the industry is better off having you in it. Thank you for all the
Thank you.
educational stuff that you provided for free. And folks, please check out all those links in the description below. Well, Mike, thank you so much for being on Top Cyber Pro podcast. And so until next time.
Thanks, Jed.